Welcome to Literally Working Through It, a podcast about how grief intersects with the work of our lives. I'm your host, Brigid Dodge, and I'm honored to have you join me in this space. Time is our most finite and precious resource, so let's dive right in. Hey y'all, checking in. How are we doing? It's been a rough start to 2026, that's for sure. I don't know about you, but for years now, just opening my phone invites a torrent of violent reality. And over the past few years, we've watched terrorist attacks and state-sanctioned murders, genocides, and displacements of entire populations of people. We're seeing aid get cut and money being reallocated to facilitate destruction and violence. At this point, staying informed seems to be in direct conflict with staying sane and healthy. There is actually a name for this: compound grief. When you experience so much loss and trauma over a period of time to the point of overwhelm. And I think a lot of us are struggling with this right now, and maybe you don't want to hear this, but that is by design. If we, the people, are too shell-shocked to act when we see these atrocities, then nothing is ever going to change. Because, as comedian Josh Johnson recently put it, yes, the moral arc of the universe bends towards justice, but nothing bends without pressure. So now is the time to acknowledge this grief and start to take small steps to understand it and integrate it so that we can also take action. I can't think of anyone more qualified to speak to this than my guest today, Reverend Amy Stapleton. Amy Stapleton is a licensed professional counselor, ordained minister, and community organizer at heart, based in Colorado. With over 25 years of experience supporting individuals through life's most challenging transitions, Amy brings both deep compassion and hard-won personal wisdom to conversations about grief and loss. Amy's career has been shaped by her commitment to advocacy and justice. She spent nearly 2 decades in the Washington, D.C. area working with organizations focused on peace, poverty, and people's rights, managing a bereavement center and working as a chaplain in hospital systems with the unhoused community. Currently, she's serving as executive pastor at a progressive faith community outside of Denver, Colorado, where every week they welcome people from all walks of life, prioritize relationships and being real, seek questions over answers, dialogue over dogma, and becoming over believing. I loved this conversation because Amy really helps us understand how we can use our grief as a way to reconnect with ourselves and our local communities. And now has never been a more important time to do this, because I firmly believe that we save ourselves when we save each other. I'm so excited for this conversation. Let's get into it. Rev Amy, thank you for joining us.
I'm happy to be here, Brigid.
I'm so happy to have you here. I would love to actually just set the stage a bit to orient us and everyone listening towards the same thing. So I'm actually going to start by asking, how do you define grief?
That's such a good opening question. I think of grief as all the emotions that we feel through any change or transition in life, not just a physical death, but really any change or transition, even a positive, what we consider a positive change, like getting a new job or moving to a place that you want to move to. And, even with changes that we create and choose, there can still be a feeling of loss and grief that accompanies those transitions.
I love that that's kind of where we're coming from, because it's not just about, the quote unquote sadness, though that is certainly an element of it. And when I was trying to decide who to have as my first guest on this podcast, I knew it needed to be someone whose life work was centered around grief. And I could not think of anyone more qualified than you. And so I would love to know what brought you to grief work.
It's one of those things that it wasn't a particular moment or a particular experience, but I would say kind of a cumulative sort of process. I had gone back to get a second master's degree in clinical counseling. Um, my mother-in-law had just died suddenly, and we had just experienced the birth of our first child, all in a process of a few months. And really, the experience of my mother in law's death and the sudden nature of that forced me to kind of look at things in a different way. I mean, grief certainly gives us a perspective like no other. We evaluate where we spend our time, our money, our energy, all of that. So there were some things going on in my life that kind of made grief more real and visible. But I guess the trailhead for me was really working as a hospital chaplain at a children's hospital in Washington, D.C. And, you see the most unbelievable deaths and griefs that walk through that door. And every time someone left after a death or a trauma, I felt like it was simply so insufficient to just have them leave and not feel like I had anything to offer beyond a prayer, beyond that moment in time which I was with them. And so I really felt kind of compelled to do more, to learn more about grief as a way of I don't know. I mean, we all grieve, right? It's something that we experience throughout our lives, but I didn't want my response simply to be take care or, I'll pray for you. I wanted it to be a learning on for me on how to walk with people as they experience the worst things in their life. And so for me, the grief work really came about as a way to accompany people throughout the best and the worst times of their life.
Hmm. Yeah, I love that. And it's really good to think about how grief connects to all the other emotions and that like you can simultaneously be experiencing a wonderful event like the birth of a child and also be experiencing a life-shattering event of losing someone that you love, someone from your family who's close to you. And those things, it's two sides of the same coin. It's the spectrum of just being a human on this planet and living life. And, a lot of listeners probably don't know that you actually officiated my husband and I's wedding 4 months after my brother died. And I remember having a moment of thinking after I learned of my brother's passing of like, oh, do we need to reschedule the wedding? And being like, for what? Like, it's
Yeah.
not like he's gonna make it at a later date. So why wouldn't we go forward with this? And so, this idea that grief and joy can simultaneously exist together, what's been your experience with that?
I think your story is a great example of that. So often we carry the both and. I mean, we're walking around with all the griefs we have ever known alongside of just trying to take the next step in what's right in front of us. And in your case, that was a beautiful wedding and witness to your love. And in some cases, that's just, being able to get out of bed, right? And say, okay, here's the next thing I can do today. So, in so many ways, people are always moving through grief, holding the both and the joy alongside of the sorrow. And grief is certainly more than just one emotion, right? It's not just sorrow, as you say, it's anger, it's frustration, it's hurt, it's confusion, it's all of that. And so we're constantly, I think, kind of just holding the both and doing the best we can and managing and moving through it.
Yeah. And I also think that, Stephen Colbert has talked about this where the joys become even more present and appreciated because you have known the opposite.
Yeah, I think that's really true as well. I mean, again, grief gives us a perspective like no other. And once we have it, we can't unsee it, unlearn it, unknow it. And it certainly impacts everything we do, everything we believe, everything that we carry with us in life.
Yeah. I lost my father and my brother at two very different stages of my life. So when my dad died, I was 26, and I, at the time, was a self-professed atheist. I was working as an animal trainer at the time, and so I really ascribed to that very Skinner-esque, like, if you cannot measure it, it does not exist kind of mindset. And speaking of my husband, we actually went on a first date and we were chatting about like religious philosophy, as one does on a first date. And he said, "Oh, have you ever heard of Carl Sagan's hypercube? It is a three-dimensional object. And when you shine a light on that object, the shadow is actually the shadow of a four-dimensional object." So here I am on this first date with my worldview just like casually crumbling while I'm talking to this guy at PF Chang's. And it shook me because here was a very respected scientist point blank saying there are things that we cannot perceive that we also know exist.
Yes.
And so that's when I really started to kind of reorient myself around what I considered to be true and not true. And, I started learning about Brene Brown's work, and in her book, The Gifts of Imperfection, she talks about spirituality. And spirituality, as she defines it, is this feeling of interconnectedness with everything around you and also something bigger than you, however you define it. But spirituality is actually foundational to wholehearted living, as she says. And so by the time my brother died, I was in a very different place in my spiritual journey. Not to say that the grief has been easier to handle, so to speak, but it has been different. And so I'm curious, from your perspective, how do you think grief changes people's perspective of spirituality?
Mm. Some people would say that spirituality, however you define that, is a protective factor, right? Like if you have something to believe in beyond yourself, however that looks, however you define that, that is a support or resource as you experience grief. In my experience, grief either kind of lends itself to people leaning more into exploring their spirituality and belief systems, or sometimes their spirituality and belief systems can be challenged or changed after a grief to the point of they seemingly are in conflict. If all your life you've been told bad things don't happen to good people, and then all of a sudden your worldview is shattered, you have a hard time putting that back together again. Or in the Christian tradition, like if you've been taught to believe like God protects us from harm or whatever that is, fill in the blank, and all of a sudden you're standing at the grave of a child who has just been killed and thinking like, wait, how does that same God let this happen? And we could say that about tragedies in the world or suicide or any sort of like death, or really any transition. But spirituality it can certainly be something that strengthens us, but I also think it's something to, as a pastoral leader, it's something to really hold lightly, because not everybody is going to come at it the same way. And I certainly don't want anyone to have the impression out there that, things wouldn't happen if you had prayed more often or been more faithful or whatever those sometimes toxic messages are that get tied and twisted, I think can also cause spiritual harm. So ultimately, I think grief forces us to look at our meaning making, to look at what we believe, not just about ourselves and the world and maybe, what's beyond ourselves. But I also think that it can be something that when we look at what sustains us in grief, it can be a real source of strength as well. I want to mention, just because I was a part of your brother's service, and we used that great reflection on why you want a physicist to speak at your funeral, that it makes sense that when we're grieving, we're looking for that lasting connection. We're looking for what's eternal, for what remains. And whether or not we call that spirituality, meaning making, I mean, that's up to every individual. But I do think it's a byproduct of grief that we long for something to connect us in a new way beyond this physical existence that we share.
Yeah. And I think that as humans, at least in society as we know it now, we feel so much more comfortable when there are rules, when there are black and white, yes and no, is not. And I think one of the things that grief does is it really point blank shows you that there really are no rules, you know? And so I think a lot of times people have sort of that crisis of faith, to use that phrase, of like, but this didn't follow the rules. And so that means what else doesn't follow the rules?
Yeah. And that can be so unsettling, right? If our worlds are built around this idea of 2 + 2 = 4, and then all of a sudden it doesn't, it can be really unsettling. And so everything kind of gets tossed up in the air. One of the best analogies I had in working with people in grief is someone said to me, it feels like your life, say your life was in a box, that someone shook up the box and they took it to a place on the whole other side of the world, dropped it and opened it and said, okay, now figure it out. You know, like you don't know the language, you don't know how you got there, you don't know the culture. And you're just like, your whole world has been changed, altered, shattered in some cases. And that's the thing. Like, again, once we experience a grief or a loss, we don't go back together in the same way. We're not Humpty Dumpty, right? Like, we can't just put our lives back together in the same way. And I think that's where the term post-traumatic growth really comes from. Is that we don't want to think and hear that like grief is a problem to be solved, but as we go through grief, I think we also have the opportunity to learn and grow in new ways and integrate grief into our life. It certainly doesn't define our life, but it forever becomes a part of who we are.
Yeah. What would you say to people who are struggling with actually integrating that grief?
Well, I think that it's a process that can't be forced. I don't think anybody has a book or a method or a podcast or, anybody has one answer that's a one size fits all, that's going to work. It's a process of each individual kind of learning themselves of what that next step is, and trusting that it takes as long as it takes, and it's an individual process. So where you are in that process of integrating your own grief isn't going to be the same as even the people in the same family who have experienced the same loss. You know, I happen to know your mom too. And I mean, you love the same people, right? Your brother and your dad, but how that grief showed up and how you moved through it and incorporated that into your life looks very different, right? So there's no judgment in grief work. There's no sort of forcing. There's no expert other than how you figure it out the best you can yourself, and hopefully surround yourself with people who are able to support you where you are and really honor that process as you move through it.
Yeah, I would say that my own individual grief journey has pushed me in my growth edge and in stretching two areas of my life where I'm not as strong as I would say, it really pushes me in the realm of patience because I don't have a lot of patience. And like you said, it takes as long as it takes. And that's an infuriating answer for someone who would like to just, check the box and move on. And then it also pushes me in the realm of trust. And the metaphor that I always use is it's like when you're an experienced surfer and you fall off your board and you get taken under and you just, no amount of fighting is going to get you to the top. You just have to trust that eventually that wave will finish rolling and it will bring you back up. And so I would love to hear your take on those two elements of the grief process, the patient part and the trust part.
Yeah, I'll start with the trust part because I love that wave metaphor in grief. I grew up not too far from the ocean. And so when we're standing at the edge of our grief, kind of like we're standing in the ocean, sometimes we just get knocked down and, our feet feel unsteady and it's hard to even find how to stand in a way that feels solid. And over time, those waves recede and they get a little less violent, if you will. But, I think for me, the whole image of standing back up and figuring that out does require a lot of patience and self compassion. But it's also kind of like permission that we give ourselves. Like my mom has been dead, it'll be 11 years just next week, actually. And as much as I know this in my head, for as much inner work that I've done around grief and therapy and all the things, podcasts and books and groups and all the things, still this time of year, about the beginning of January, I just get like a bear and I'm like impatient and I'm grumpy and I'm emotional and I'm kind of like, what's going on? And I know that date is lingering out there, but I just feel it and carry it in my body. And so, the more you're a surfer much more than I am, but the more that you resist, I think the harder it is, right? And sometimes you just got to go in the flow of it and you got to release and you got to let go and you got to just be where you are and feel what you feel. The patient part, I mean, I feel you there. I'm pretty impatient, like in general, with myself, with the world, especially with things that I want and feel should be different. But I think grief invites us to also have a lot of self compassion where things happen and they're not things that we particularly chose or wanted or planned for. And so the ability to integrate grief, something really hard that we've never done or experienced before, is, it's kind of an impossible ask of the universe. So, in my experience, both personally and professionally, I think it requires us to just be really gentle with ourselves, to kind of honor the grief and not try to resist it or force it or make it fit into this neat little box on one day a week where we can just honor the people we love who have died or honor the grief that we're experiencing and think that it's just going to fit that neatly into our lives. I mean, sometimes it feels like a tsunami, right? And sometimes it feels like a hurricane and sometimes it just comes when it comes and that slow sort of trickle in of the wave, but gosh, it's always there.
I love what you said in terms of like just even having the awareness. That's funny. My dad's death will also be next week and it'll be 13 years. And I am always aware that around November, because that's when the holidays start. And the holidays, there's this anticipatory buildup of like, oh, how are the holidays going to feel this year? And then after the holidays are over, like I'm not even done because then it's the anniversary. And so it's like it's another hurdle after something that was already difficult. But just having the awareness is like step one to being able to invite that in and treat it a little bit more gently and treat yourself a little bit more gently.
Yeah, and some years for me, that's look like, I take the day off work and I do something for myself. I go get a massage or I go outside for a hike. Some days that kind of looks like, I don't know, in years past where a lot of people will call and text and just say, thinking of you and your mom today, or they'll post something on Facebook or Instagram. And honestly, I just don't want to even turn those things on or respond. I kind of check out. So every year it's been a little different for me, but I really try to honor what I need. If I need a nap, if, whatever, a long bath, whatever that is that day, I really try to prioritize myself. And that's not to say that other people aren't grieving her too, and I want to honor that for them. But it's kind of like the plane and the image of the oxygen mask. You have to put it on yourself first, even though that's not always intuitive. And so I really try to honor the grief and what I need, especially on those days.
Yeah. And I'd actually love to touch a little bit about social media because I
Okay.
think I remember a very specific moment where I walked into Target and it was right before Father's Day and I saw all the Father's Day cards and I was like, I had this urge of like, what if I just like ripped down that display of
Yeah.
Father's Day cards? And then same thing, like when you log onto social media, you don't get to choose what you're seeing. It is what the algorithm feeds you. And, I've been at the point where it's like Father's Day doesn't even register on my calendar because it's not something that is necessarily like prevalent in my life anymore. And then I will log on to social media and I'll get this like wave of Happy Father's Day, Dad. And it just like it takes me back because I'm like,
Yeah.
oh, yeah, this thing, this gap, this grief still exists.
Yeah.
And again, it goes back to that awareness of what day is it? What are you maybe going to see? What are you maybe going to hear from people? And is that right for you in this moment? How do you think that that affects grief and the grieving process?
Mm. The image that comes to mind for me is kind of like a garage door sometimes that we need to put down to say, not today. Like I really can't absorb or let anything else in. Um, some people find a lot of comfort in social media and kind of sharing memories and resharing memories and having people acknowledge their loss, their feelings, their loved ones. So I think it varies individually. So my dad's also dead. And my brother, for him, like when he became a father, Father's Day took on a different take. So like he really kind of struggled with like, how do I honor my dad when I feel like, I don't know, crappy, right? Like I want to be with my son and I want to celebrate like all that he is in my life and our connection. But like I'm just really sitting here in my own grief and I don't feel happy and I don't want to have a cookout and all those things. So he had to navigate that. I tend to avoid like Hallmark and stores and like that time of year. I'm with you. Like I just don't want it in my face that much. With Mother's Day, now that I am a mother, I would say again, and this might sound, well, it sounds however it sounds, right? No judgment, but like I just prioritize myself, and it's kind of like I do other things to honor my mom, but not on that day. So, for example, one of my favorite traditions is the last Christmas my mom was with us before she died. My mom loved shoes, and she would always give me a pair of shoes or boots for Christmas. So even now, 11 years later, I always buy myself shoes for Christmas and I put them under the tree from her. And my kids are like, wait, how did Nana buy you a gift? Like, how does that work? Where's our gifts? But, it's just my way of kind of like saying, okay, this is like something I'm doing for myself that she would certainly do if she were here. And it keeps me connected to kind of the fullness of her life, like the joy of Christmas, rather than just the day of her death. So, social media, I think, can either help or hinder, but it's really an individual choice. And it probably varies year to year, day by day, right? As to if that's something we want in our mix, as we honor the people we love, or if that's not. And it's always our choice.
I love that idea of figuring out how to do something that will keep you connected to that person, that loved one, that thing, that event, whatever it may be, because I think a lot of the grief is the severing of that the supposed severing of that connection.
Yeah. We had talked earlier about how do you care for yourself as you're grieving, and I just want to offer here, like, again, no judgment, but whether it's those little rituals that we build into anniversaries in our daily existence, or if it's the permission we give ourselves, especially around the holiday, to not feel festive and go all out and sing the Christmas carols, or whatever that is. Grief is more of an internal process, and social media can for some people be that outward expression, and that can feel an important part of their process to support them in their grief, but really, I think it starts with us and what is it we need, recognizing those needs, and giving ourselves permission to do what we need in the midst of our grief.
I think that that is such a good thing to keep in mind, that we will need different things at different times. And I'm curious too, because when grief is your life's work, as it is with you, not only do you need to care for yourself when you're having moments of your own personal grief, but I'm wondering how you care for yourself, when it is your job to witness other people's grief.
I like that you use the term witness, right? Because sometimes people approach grief as, again, a problem to solve. It's something we got to fix, right? It's so often I find our own inability to sit with grieving people, comes from a place of our own sort of fear, right? Like, we think of grief as being contagious. If I'm sitting with you and you're full on grieving, then it's really hard for me not to want to fix that or solve that problem for you, or even acknowledge, oh wait, like, if that just happened to Brigid, that could happen to me. And oh, that gets really close, and my own vulnerability and fear starts to pop up. So I think the way that I look at grief work, as a pastor, as a professional, but also just as a person, is to really be with people, in their grief, with their grief. I don't have to fix it. I don't have to solve it. I just get to be with, and that's such a sacred privilege, to accompany people as they grieve. I think that's what I love so much about grief work as a therapist, is like, kind of, there's no bullshit to it. It's just real and raw, and it is what it is. And so, like, there's not this dance often that comes, sometimes I find, in the therapeutic process, where people are starting with their heads and it takes them a long time to get to their hearts. But with grief work, it's all out there. And most people I find that I work with in that way, they go deep really fast, because it's just the water they're swimming in. And they just want somebody to say, hey, do you see this? Do you see me? Like, I'm not out here alone, right? And that's the privilege of doing this kind of work, is just to remind people that while your grief is real and unique, to you as an individual, like, you're not alone. Um, I think these are the times and ways that we can be a witness for one another.
And I think you hit the nail on the head in terms of it hitting so close to home when you see it in someone else, because it is the inevitable thing that connects us all. We will all lose something that's important to us. We will all lose our own lives. Like, none of us are immortal. That is the thing that we contend with. That is kind of what makes life so devastatingly beautiful, is that it's completely impermanent. But I think that, as Brene says, it takes a lot of courage to sit with someone in the darkness and not rush to turn on the light.
Yes.
And obviously, there are people who say things that are well intentioned, but maybe don't have the impact that they wanted. And I think a lot of other people are so afraid that they just don't say anything because they don't know what to say. And I'm curious what you would say to someone who doesn't know yet how to witness their friend's grief, their mother's grief, their, sister's grief, whatever that other person having it being activated for themselves. What are
Mhm.
some tools that you think that people can learn or lean into to help them better show up for the other people in their lives?
I guess the first and foremost would just be to kind of acknowledge what you don't know, right? To just say to someone, "Hey, I haven't really been through this or had this type of loss or experience, but I really care about you and I'm here and I'm going to stay here." And that doesn't mean just kind of like, hey, I'm gonna like make you a casserole and then call it done, right? It's I think being willing to kind of ride the wave with people and to recognize that it's not probably a one moment sort of interaction and then you're done and your friend's gonna get back to normal and be at happy hour next week and be happy, right? So I think it's more of a willingness to be a good friend that says, not only I don't know what to say or I don't know how to help, but I'm here to kind of acknowledge what you don't know. And then I would also say to really be patient and understanding as much as you can be of a friend or a family member going through grief to recognize emotions change every second as you're grieving. And so say you had plans and you and your friend were going to go do something and then at the last minute they call and say, you know what, I'm not really up for that or I'm not feeling that at this time, I want to go out or whatever you were going to do. I think there's a grace that we can give one another as we're grieving that says, okay, I hear you, I honor that. Can I come be with you, or is there something I can do to support you right now? So I think it's important not to make assumptions or take things personally, but to really check out with people who are grieving what feels like support, what feels good to them. I'm a person that some things don't feel supportive, right? Like it would not feel supportive to me to have someone just show up at my house unannounced and be like, "Hey, like
Lasagna.
yeah, that wouldn't be my deal." But I remember after my mom died, my daughter was only about a year old, and someone went grocery shopping for me, and they just left the groceries on my door, and like that was the best thing ever, just to kind of be like, "Here, I thought these are some things you could use." That was such an act of kindness. So I think it's important to check out with people what feels like support and not make assumptions about that.
And one thing that I had a friend do that I think is really, it's good to speak it plainly was when she sends texts to people who she knows are going through grief, she always prefaces it with, there's no need to respond to this. I
Yes,
just
yes,
want to let you know that I'm thinking about you. Or there's no need to respond to this, but I would love to stop by this week and sit with you. And
yes,
it gives, because like when someone passes away, you get inundated with calls and texts and you're kind of like retelling this story over and over and over again, and for someone to say like you don't need to get back to me immediately, like that, it feels like such a weight off of, at least for in my experience, it feels like such a weight off of my shoulders because it's like, oh, okay, one less thing that I have to do amongst the deluge of things that have to get done when you're
yeah.
in the grieving process.
Yeah, I remember like that very same thing came up around sending thank you notes after a funeral, right? Like people bring food or flowers or make donations or whatever. And it just felt like a chore that like I couldn't do. And of course I was grateful that people showed up and gave generously and did all the things, but like I mean, it took me probably a solid 7 months to write thank you notes because I wanted them to be genuine and I wanted them to come from my heart. But it was kind of like, I can't do this right now. So to have somebody give you that permission to say, yeah, I don't need a response, or I don't need a thank you note, or hey, I just want you to know I'm here, and you don't have to talk about it unless you want to talk about it. That's such a gift of friendship.
Yeah, everybody has it's almost like getting into a relationship where a lot of people will get into a relationship with a person and they won't set expectations around what that relationship is going to look like. Like, I do laundry on Saturdays, but the other
Yeah.
person's like, no, I do laundry when the laundry basket's full. And you don't talk about that. And so
Yeah.
that's like, then you're in conflict and you're like, why is this person not doing the laundry? And I think it kind of goes the same thing with your relationship with someone who's grieving, of like setting expectations of, I don't need this right now. I don't need you to come to this thing. I'm inviting you, but I don't need you to come. Like, just speaking those expectations or those unsaid things can be really helpful in sort of like eliminating those assumptions.
Yeah. And I think that's true with our friends. I think it's true with our family. I think it's especially true for our intimate partners that, like, we have some communication around grief needs and expectations. I'm not a person, for example, like, I don't want somebody to like pat my back when I cry. Like, I kind of just want to full on cry, and tears are good. I feel like that's a natural release of whatever we're feeling. And so just to be able to have people around us to get that, to help us, like, support us in the ways that feel most loving, I think it's, to your point, really important to communicate what that support looks like.
Hmm. What would you say to a person who, in the midst of their grief, does not know what is supportive in that moment?
Yeah, that's totally fair. Maybe it's just like, I don't know what I need, but can you stay here? Or can you pick up the kids from school so I can have a moment to just catch my breath? Or, it could be a definite moment by moment thing. And of course, we don't always know what we need in the moment. Sometimes we have to try it on. I mean, I think about people who, I'm especially thinking about the holidays just because we just wrap those up, but like, people who think it's a good idea to like go to a Christmas party, for example, because they miss people and they want to be connected to community. And of course, that sounds fun, and all the things in our head that we kind of convince ourselves of. And then the minute we get in the car to drive over there, it's like complete overwhelm. I don't want to get out. I don't want to be the one there without a partner. I don't want to have to talk to people and tell the story one more time and all the things. So I think it goes back to that idea of permission giving, and like giving ourselves permission to acknowledge what we need when we know it, but also when we try something, if it doesn't feel good to our own souls, permission to change, permission to do something different in the moment and not get caught up in the fear of, oh, I'm going to disappoint people, let people down, whatever. It's really about us when we grieve.
I love that idea of kind of like trying things on and getting experimental because, like, what else are you doing in the midst of grief other than like trying to figure it out?
Yeah.
Let's pivot a little bit. Last week was a really heavy week for a lot of us. And I think that people around the country, maybe even people around the world, are having realizations that the world itself is very different from what they had previously been taught or been told or lived in themselves. And I would say that there's a lot of collective grief that we're all experiencing around this sort of reorientation. Can you speak a little more to collective grief itself and how that's the same or how that's different from individual loss?
Yeah, collective grief is certainly a thing. It's not, I would say, heavily acknowledged. But there's a term for it. It's called disenfranchised grief. And what that really means is it's kind of the grief that goes unacknowledged. So, somebody watching what's happening in Minnesota and Renee Good and like all of that, they may find themselves like crying or weeping or angry, like, why do I feel a connection to this person beyond a human connection? And all this grief comes up in a whole different way around, to your point, like the state of humanity in the world. And I think the first thing we have to acknowledge, whether that's in Minnesota or Oregon or honestly in the Middle East and Gaza, that like we constantly are moving through transitions in our lives and in the world that we grieve, that we are impacted by. I remember working with a group of young adults, high schoolers actually, on a climate change project, and they brought me in to talk with them about grief around the climate and sort of, they're actively working to change things and make things better, but they're also deeply grieving a future that they're inheriting that is quite devastating to them, and they didn't really know what to call it or what to do with it. So disenfranchised grief is really that grief that goes unacknowledged. Like, nobody's showing up at your house with casseroles. Nobody's like, we don't have rituals for that or ceremonies for that in the same way that we do like a physical death. But it's even more important, I feel, to acknowledge the grief that goes kind of unacknowledged, because if we don't, we just carry it around with us and wonder, like, why am I so angry or upset or sad or whatever? And it doesn't have a place, it doesn't have a name, it doesn't have, any way to really be self-expressed. And then that's when I feel like grief can really weigh the heaviest. I think when we can acknowledge it, name it, give it a place, put some ritual or experiences around it to help us honor that it gives voice to it and it legitimizes everything that we're feeling.
Yeah. And when you talk about like rituals and stuff, I always think about Viola Davis in her biography talks about going to Africa and having this moment of realization of like how much this idea of rugged individualism is harming us in the Western world, because she saw that there are these like community rituals around almost anything in life, and there are these things that people do together to, like you said, acknowledge that. Whereas we don't really have a lot of that in the Western world. And obviously I'm speaking from a very American perspective, but we see this kind of coming up in cycles of like, right now where everybody's talking about Renee Good, and yet you have Black and brown bodies that have always been dealing with this type of grief and this type of violence against them. And I would love to know, what do you think community really means in terms of like coming together around the reckoning of these events and the way that this world is kind of set up?
I think it first starts with telling our stories, telling the stories of pain, the depth of pain, and not kind of glossing over them as a historical moment or simply just a moment in time, but certainly from like a historical trauma perspective, recognizing the trauma that Black and brown bodies have experienced over centuries, right? Our Indigenous siblings have experienced for centuries. That's a grief that is always carried and is never truly healed, right? So in a case of collective grief like we've been living in, I would say for some time now, I think community, at the heart of community, is truth telling. It's naming the pain, it's naming the harm, it's not trying to fix it. acknowledging it and honoring it. You know yourself, like when someone dies, you get 3 days off, right? Like, and that's the best you get, and you're kind of expected to get back in it. The collective grief and trauma that's going on right now, I think, is unprecedented and unparalleled in some ways, because we're still expected to produce, to get back to like live as if everything's fine, and it's not fine. And so I think that the times and places where we can acknowledge that this isn't okay, we have to stop and acknowledge the harm and the trauma and tell the truth about that and the cost of that and who it cost. That's the first step, because that takes a grief that's been disenfranchised and makes it real and visible and something that we all have to reckon with, right? And see and acknowledge. So yeah, I think that's an important step, is the truth telling and the naming of that as a grief. This is not okay.
Yeah. And I think that until we openly admit that this is not okay, we can't take that and transmute it into something else. I know that you have been involved in a lot of social justice work, and I would be curious to hear you talk about how that collective grief does inform social justice.
Mhm. I think about both in like South Africa and Greensboro, North Carolina, and other places where they've had like truth and reconciliation commissions over time, right? And I think for me, how grief is connected to social justice is it's part of our why. I want to believe that we can create a world together and coexist together where, yeah, there's always going to be death and there's always going to be pain, but how we collectively hold that can be in a way to not reinforce that pain or to not reinforce that trauma, but to disrupt those systems that are harmful, and to stop cycles of harm, honestly, by telling the truth about our past, by learning from that, by saying that we're making a different and conscious choice in the present, not to transmit that trauma or that pain. I think especially that in light of my own racial identity as a white woman from the South, right? Like, I've had to listen to the pain of others, um, and that's not always an easy thing to do. And yet, I think it's necessary, because you can't, just like you can't rush grief, you can't rush reconciliation, you can't rush repair. So I think the greatest, I don't know, gift isn't probably the right word, but the greatest witness we can be to another's pain is to simply be with them in it, and to acknowledge it and validate it and recognize what that's cost them, and to say, like, in grief or in life or in justice, I want to be an ally to walk with you in that and to accompany you as you move through that.
I think right now, a lot of people are in this freeze state. You have the fight, flight, fawn, or freeze, and I think a lot of people are just frozen. And I like how we've kind of connected the dots of, like, there are people who don't know what to say to an individual who is grieving their own specific loss event. But then we have a whole population of people who have been constantly grieving centuries of injustice. And we still don't know what to say or how to sit with those people. And it becomes a matter of acknowledging the discomfort. And like we talked about earlier, like, not rushing to necessarily fix anything in the way that we think it needs to be fixed. But what happens when you're so inundated with this, which is by design, right? Like, it's part of the plan is to just make us deer in the headlights so that we
Yeah.
don't know what to do. And there's so much that needs to be done and so much that should be fixed. What does someone do when they're feeling that just like wide-eyed, oh no, I'm paralyzed. What can I do to actually do anything?
Hmm. Hmm. One of my favorite quotes says something like this. I think it's by E. E. Hale, but it kind of says, I cannot do everything, but I will do something. That's my paraphrasing of that. So just taking the next step, whatever that is, whether that's after a physical death and loss that you've experienced yourself or a communal grief and the times that we're living in, I think it's just whatever that next step is. And some days that can be just taking a shower if you're an individual that's just trying to get out of bed and function in your life. Or as a community, that's like thinking about, what are the concrete steps I can do from where I am to contribute to a different experience for someone who's different than me. I was at an event yesterday and they were giving out whistles to be able to blow for, if you're in a situation and you see an ice raid about to go down. That can be writing a letter to your congressperson. That can be showing up at a vigil or a rally and just saying, like, I'm here. I'm physically, visibly here because I care. That can be on a more kind of mutual aid way of saying and supporting friends and community who are incarcerated or who are showing up. And I know of a organization I'm a part of who in our community, in the Latino community that we're connected to, they're afraid to leave their homes. So it's being able to say, hey, I can go to the grocery store for you, or I can bring by a pack of diapers for your kid. So I think sometimes, like whether it's individual or communal, it can get so big in our head that we have to think we have to figure it out or know it all or plan 50 steps down the road. Um, but sometimes it's just as simple as taking that next step. And I don't mean to imply that simple is easy. I just mean that it can just be that one thing that you do that day. I mean, honestly, it can just be like being kind to someone. And I was walking in the grocery store the other day and I just smiled at someone and said hi. I mean, I kept on walking, but I saw them and I just said hi. And she stopped me. She said, you're the first person that's spoken to me all day. And I thought, wow, I mean, that took nothing for me, right? But we're living in this culture where everything can feel so heavy and political and charged that sometimes it's just as easy, simple rather, as saying hi and being kind and acknowledging I see you. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, whether it's an individual or communal grief, isn't that what we all want? Is to just be witnessed, acknowledged, seen, valued, loved. So, yeah, I think we just start where we are with what we can, with just one thing.
Yeah. Just deciding what is the next right thing and then doing that. And then
Yeah.
after that, what is the next right thing and doing that. We had someone in my neighborhood organize a neighborhood block party for the first time since they had been living there and they moved in 2014. So we're talking like what 12, 13, 14 years at this point. But our neighbors across the street was like, yo, we've lived here for 6 years and we haven't met anyone.
Wow.
And the man who was hosting the community neighborhood party, he stood up and he was like, I don't know what to do other than to care for my neighbors, to care about my neighbors. Like, if we know our neighbors, then we will care about their kids, we'll care about their houses. That's all I can think of that I can do in this moment is to
Yeah.
just get more familiar with my own community. And he actually teared up when he was talking about that. I love the idea of like putting the digital community down and really focusing more on like that in-person community whenever it is feasible and possible for you in your moments. Because at the end of the day, that's all we have.
I think it's really in times of grief that we see who our community is in the fullness of that community, right? COVID, I lived just outside of Washington, D.C. during COVID, and so everything was really locked down. And in the early days, one person on our street would go to the grocery store for all the elders on our street, right? Or people would drop by, like if they had extra hand sanitizer or toilet paper or whatever that was, there was the sense of like, we're in it together. And somewhere along the way, as you say, it's been reinforced that we don't need each other. But throughout centuries, throughout time, throughout place, I think it's always been the reality that not only do we need each other to survive, but we need each other to thrive, right? Like we need to be seen and loved and connected in community because, as you say, ultimately, at the end of the day, that's all we have. I can't tell you how many people I sit with who that's partially why they come to church. It's probably less about what they believe and more about like their connections and being a part of a community that really values their presence and sees and acknowledge them and will call if they don't show up on a Sunday morning, right? So yeah, I think getting back to those ancient ways of connection, community, commitment to one another, that's the essence of our survival.
Yeah, couldn't have said it better myself.
I love the energy and the truth telling that you bring to grief. That's what I love about grief work in general is that it's real, it's gritty, it's raw. I don't think everybody can do that. It's when I was going through graduate school to be a therapist, at the end of our clinical time, we all got to kind of choose our area of therapy. And a lot of my friends kind of wanted to work in an agency or they were very clear on what they wanted to do. They wanted to do addiction work or fill in the blank, whatever it was. At that time, I would have never said, "Oh, I'm choosing grief. Like this is going to be it for me." But now I see that grief shows up in every part of our life. And even if somebody comes in my door and they say they're coming because they're struggling with anxiety or an angry family member or whatever that is, grief is always there. So I'm just excited that you are elevating the conversation on grief in a way that hopefully makes it more accessible for more people, that has an opportunity for people to see themselves and kind of reflected in your words and your guests and experiences so that ultimately nobody feels alone in their grief. It's an individual and a communal process and certainly unique to each person, but collectively and as a whole of humanity, I think it's something that we all deal with and experience and carry within us. So thank you for creating this platform for us to connect in this way.
Thank you. I'm trying to channel my own anger and transmute that because, like you said earlier, like the fact that the industry standard bereavement leave is 3 to 5 days is so infuriating to me. Because, yeah, like you said, like you may not have chosen grief, but like grief will choose you. Like grief will show up in your life no matter what. And what can we do other than start to dismantle those systems that prevent us from being able to experience our full humanity and not just be these little production machines? Because that's not what we're meant to do.
Yeah. And ultimately, that's not what will sustain us, right? Like, um, I think about in the 17 and 18 and even early 1900s, people wore all black for months, or, they wore armbands, or people sit Shiva, lots of different expressions of grief, but it doesn't fit into a 3-day window. It doesn't fit into this box or a society that just keeps telling us to get back on and produce more and do more. And I think that's really harming our souls because we aren't making space to honor what's truly sacred and truly human about our shared experience together, which is life and death and grief and everything in between.
Absolutely. Rev Amy, thank you so much for being a part of this. I know that you are a busy woman and your time is valuable. All of our time is valuable. That's what grief teaches us. It is our most finite and precious resource. And so I'm grateful that you were willing to give a little bit of that to us today.
It's been an honor, Brigid. Thanks so much.
Literally Working Through It is literally a one-woman production. It's produced by me, hosted by me, and edited by me. If you would like to support the work that I do, please consider becoming a paid subscriber on the Literally Working Through It Substack. You can also connect with me on socials at Literally Working Through It on Facebook, Instagram, and Threads.